All right, and welcome back to the NSMA, National Spectrum Management Association's 39th Annual Conference. We're now jumping into 6 gigahertz. So this is where we talk about, hertz at all hertz, 6 gigahertz. So the panel will be run in the according fashion. We'll have Dr. Tom Willis, a board member, jump off and sort of set the stage for some of the current issues underway in terms of the sharing matters. And we have George Kaiser, an NSMA board member and past president. He's online. He'll also contribute. And we have Mark Gibson, Senior Director, Spectrum Regulatory Policy from CommScope, who will also engage after George Kaiser. And then we have we're very honored to have Professor Manisha Ghosh, who will give a big picture on, I think you have a lot of experience in the measurement area, and we're very happy to have you here and learn more about that, give some context to what's happening. So, and just real quick, I want to give a little background for everyone. So, Tom Willis, as I mentioned, is a past board member, or is a current board member, and he works in the area of microwave wireless communications at AT&T in Middletown, New Jersey, where he's been for the last 35 years. He holds a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Michigan, Go Blue. He also is a chair of NSMA's Working Group 2 over the rise and propagation loss and his projects. And he's also on the Fixed Wireless Communications Coalition board, serving as vice president. He represents AT&T at the Wind Forum and 6 gigahertz effort and chairs the 6 gigahertz interference task force. As for George Kaiser, who's coming in remotely, and you'll see him on the screen when he's speaking, he is an immediate past president, and he's also president of Television Inc., where he consults in telecommunications systems with a main focus on fixed point-to-point microwave radios and associated network management systems. He authored Digital Microwave Communication, and is a contributing chapter to the volume 2 of the Handbook of Microwave Technology. He's pretty much the grandfather of microwave, so we're always happy to have George speaking. He was author of several peer-reviewed technical articles. If you go to the IEEE Explorer Library, you can look him up, and your screen will be filled with George Kaiser ditties. He's the chairman of the TIA Working Group for Microwave Systems, technical chairman of the Fixed Wireless Communications Coalition, and as mentioned, a past president of NSMA, and also a past chairman of the TIA Fixed Point-to-Point Microwave section. As for Mark Gibson, we're welcoming Mark back. He's got over 4 decades of wireless experience. He's responsible for developing domestic and international business opportunities for CommScope in the area of RF engineering and spectrum management, in addition to leading technical and business development efforts for numerous wireless and spectrum-related products and services. He's led efforts to address spectrum sharing between the federal government and commercial users. He leads CommScope's efforts to develop, test, and certify the automated frequency coordination system, which you'll hear a lot about here in the 6 gigahertz unlicensed bands. He's president and chair of the Wireless Innovation Forum. He's a member of the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, where he's also co-chaired working groups related to spectrum sharing and data exchange issues, and has testified before the U.S. Congress on spectrum policy related matters. He's led spectrum management efforts, including spectrum sharing analysis protocols and sharing criteria, as well as development of engineering services and software products. He speaks frequently and has authored several papers on spectrum sharing and relocation, and has advised numerous wireless participants in their system design. He has a BSEE from the University of Maryland, go Terps, and is a life member of IEEE. So welcome back, Mark. And so you've seen a lot of, for those of you who follow our 6 gigahertz matters, you've seen Mark and Tom and George before, and we have a new distinguished speaker on the 6 gigahertz panel. We're very happy to welcome Professor Manisha Ghosh, University of Notre Dame and Policy Director of Spectrum X. She's a professor of electrical engineering at Notre Dame, completed a term as a chief technology officer at the FCC on June 14th of 2021. In this role, she reported to the chairman of the FCC and was closely involved in setting national strategy and technology specifications related to the explosive growth of broadband wireless communications technologies. Professor Ghosh previously served in the NSF as a rotating program director within the Directorate of Computer and Information Science and Engineering, where she managed wireless network research. At the NSF, she initiated one of the first large-scale programs that targets applications of machine learning to wireless networks from 2015 to 2021. She also was a research professor at the University of Chicago, where she conducted research on wireless technologies for the 5G cellular, next generation Wi-Fi systems, IoT, coexistence, and spectrum sharing. She previously worked in industry research and development at InterDigital, at Philips Research, and at Bell Laboratories on wireless systems such as the HDTV broadcast standard, cable standardization, and cognitive radio, the TV white spaces. She's a fellow of the IEEE. So we're very blessed to have this panel getting going. And I think with that, we'll let Dr. Willis kick off. Don't trip on the wires.
I'll do my best. Okay, well, it did not go unnoticed by myself that this panel is the only thing separating you from lunch today. So I tried to make my comments brief. I'm really just going to give an overview of sort of what's been going on in the 6 gigahertz band in the last 4 years or so. The other panelists will probably get into more details about specifics on that. So the first question you might ask is, who are the legacy incumbents in the 6 gigahertz band? Because, those are the folks that new entrants in the band are going to have to live with. And the answer is there are a lot of fixed service point-to-point microwave systems in that band. This is a map of the contiguous U.S. Users of the fixed service users of the band. This is the lower 6 and upper 6 gigahertz users. You can see it's a pretty densely covered map. Most of the country's got stuff in it. There are also paths in Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, other U.S. territories. And that data is all, publicly available in the FCC's ULS database, which is what I use to put this map together. There are about 105,000 licensed radios in those two sections of the band, the upper 6 and lower 6 bands, also known as the Uni 5 and Uni 7 band. AT&T has about 12,000 of those radios. So, my employer has some skin in the game here. So that's why I've been involved in this effort over the last several years. So who are the new entrants in the band? And that are some unlicensed systems that the FCC has permitted to enter the band. Currently, there are sort of 3 classes of unlicensed users in the band. There are these low-powered indoor users, which are allowed to operate anywhere within the entire 1200 megahertz of spectrum from 5925 to 7125 megahertz. There are also standard power devices, which just recently were allowed to enter the band. Those users are allowed to operate in the 500 megahertz of the Uni 5 band and the 350 megahertz of the Uni 7 band. The rules for those users did come out in the April 2020 report and order from the FCC. However, one of the conditions on those users is they did have to be controlled by a thing known as the Automatic Frequency Coordination System. And it took about 4 years to get those things up and running, develop the standards, get the companies qualified, go through public testing and so forth. But earlier this year, 7 companies did go online, including ComSearch, which one of my fellow panelists here, Mark Gibson, works for, so I'm sure he can talk about that. And then we also recently, at the beginning of this year, had very low power devices, which were allowed to go online. Again, those were more restrictive power limitations on those devices, and they were only permitted in the Uni 5 and Uni 7 band. So it's a complicated landscape. There's a lot of new types of unlicensed entrants in the band, and there's more discussions going on about even adding more types of or classes of unlicensed devices to the 6 gigahertz band. I think Mark's going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later today. So let's talk about the standard power devices, which are one of the 3 classes. They do have to be managed by an automatic frequency control system, or AFC. The AFC system is based on FCC rules, Part 15.407, as well as a standard which was developed within the Wireless Innovation Forum, or the WIN Forum, standard TS 1014. Specifies a lot of details which are not included in the FCC rules about how the AFC systems should operate. The unlicensed devices do have to request access to spectrum from the AFC system, and when they do so, they have to, define where they are located, and so they have to define some region of space where there's a 95% confidence that they're somewhere in there. So the AFC system then is going to assume that they could be anywhere within that range and go through its calculations to figure out, what channels they can operate on and at what power levels. The AFC system is supposed to protect the incumbent point-to-point service users to an I/N ratio of, better than -6 dB, which was the same criteria that has been traditionally used within the fixed service community when they coordinate amongst themselves. So there's a calculation that has to be done, that calculation about how much interference is going to come into the incumbent users. That calculation requires propagation models. According to the FCC rules, if the interference path is 1 kilometer or greater, they use the ITM model, which, if you're not familiar with it, that is a publicly available model that's published by the NTIA, and it can be downloaded by anyone. It is based on the Longley-Rice propagation model. It does involve needing a path profile on that interference path based on terrain data. If you're between 30 meters and 1 kilometer, use the Winner 2 model, which was a model that really came out of mobility, propagation, characteristics, and coverage calculations. And if you're less than 30 meters away, if you happen to be that close to an incumbent receiver, you're supposed to use free space loss. So the AFC system does have to consider interference into the primary receive antenna of the incumbent point-to-point system. And if the incumbent point-to-point system has a diversity receive antenna, which about 1/3 of the systems do, to try to help mitigate atmospheric multipath, you also have to worry about interference into that. And then there are some systems out there that also use passive repeaters or passive reflectors, and you need to worry about interference that could couple into those and ultimately be relayed back into the incumbent receiver antenna. So it's the point of all this discussion here is the calculation is not simple. It involves a lot of stuff. It involves a lot of data, involves a lot of propagation models. And so it did take a while to sort of nail down all the parameters to use in those propagation models, and also go through, developing these tools and testing them. As an additional complication that I just want to bring to people's attention, the dominant unlicensed user, at least right now in the 6 gigahertz band, are the Wi-Fi 6E users. And the Wi-Fi 6E devices have a channel plan, which is sort of based on sort of 20 megahertz channels, which then can be combined into 40 and 80 and 160. And it's not on this chart right now, but there are also 320 megahertz channels that are being worked with Wi-Fi 6E. Whereas the incumbents are basically use a 30 megahertz channel plan. And so there are narrower band channels where they've divided like the 30s up into 310 megahertz channels and so forth. And there's 60 in the Uni 5 band, the lower 60 gigahertz band. There are 60 megahertz channels as well, where they combine a couple of 30s. But the point is, the two channel plans, totally dissimilar to each other. They don't line up at all. So when you're looking at interference situations, you can have completely co-channel situations. You can have, partial overlaps of channels, or you can have adjacent channel interference. So this does add an additional layer of complication to all these calculations, and just want to make people aware of that. So in just sort of summary remarks here, obviously the increasing demand for wireless bandwidth is going to make more and more sharing strategies necessary. And the FCC is moving that way. I mean, TV white space was a very early example. CBRS is probably another great example. and now 6 gigahertz is yet another example. But I would expect to see more and more of this in other bands as we move forward. One of the ways we can share are using these more sophisticated methods based on propagation models and databases. Obviously, 6 gigahertz is a good example of that, an early example of that. But the last point I'd also like to point out here is that actual field testing and experiment and doing experiments and measurements with real life systems is also very important to sort of calibrate the propagation models that you use in these sort of strategies. As interesting and as much fun as it is to work with like the electromagnetic theory and build the computer models and look at the data and look at all the parameters you can plug into your propagation model. At the end of the day, you're trying to predict something in reality, and so going back and doing measurements that you can sort of calibrate that stuff against is very important. So with that, that sort of concludes my comments and remarks on the 6 gigahertz. So at that, I'll turn it over for the other panelists.
Do you take
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It's awesome actually because and so AT&T actually has licenses, so they are the incumbent. So we have INL Water Security Institute. So we are starting to look because the utilities, there's a lot of also utilities under the umbrella of DOE, power utilities, they have fixed links, right? Just like AT&T does. Now, AFC it's awesome to have this, as you said, it's good to have this system. And I think they are just coming out, right? They have not been really out there doing their things already.
Well, the standard power AFC control stuff is just coming out now.
Coming out, right?
Yeah.
So I think the point you made is, I think we really believe that we really need to see some data, and maybe there is some more tuning to be done, and maybe it has to be advanced over the years as more and more Wi-Fi 6E coming in numbers of millions, right? They are just coming up now. And to really see whether it's working, it's doing what it's intended to do, right? Or even going one step further, something like that can be an attack surface, because if you hack that or do something with that, it can break the whole sharing scheme, right? So any thoughts on that with your, I think you quite clearly quite a bit about how AFCs came about and what it's trying to do and things of that sort.
Well, I think one of your questions was in there. Could someone sort of game the system and hack the AFC? There's a bunch of security stuff on top of this that the FCC insisted on to make sure that doesn't happen. And let's hope that is the case.
To verify that, right?
Yeah, but you want to verify it. Yes, yeah. And at AT&T, we are looking at ways to monitor our incumbent links to see if we think we're being interfered with. And again, the vendors that build the point-to-point microwave radio systems are also looking at what sort of operation support systems can we put into these systems so that we can monitor these things. So if we do think we're getting interference, we can at least alert people.
In addition to AFC.
Yeah. This is things that are going on by the incumbent users and the radio vendors that build the radios for the incumbent fixed service. So it's going to take some time. It's going to evolve with time because the radios are going to have, that kind of software is going to have to be upgraded out in the network and so forth. I'm sure there'll be growing pains, but but the real life experience, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I think it's interference over noise. I'm not so sure if the acronym stands for interference.
Yeah, the I over N.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is it in what part of the circuit are you talking about? After the ELNA, after down conversion? What is
it's typically defined as the receive port of the incumbent radio. So there'll be a certain interference power that may be coming into it, and it will have a certain noise level. So yeah.
Basically at the
well, at the radio port. There can be waveguide. There could be waveguide between the antenna and the radio, but it's at the input to the radio. Yeah.
at the input of the
All right. Well, thank you. I'll turn it over now to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Tom. We're going to have George Kaiser looking to our technical.
So fire away, and then we'll have, I don't know if you heard earlier, then we'll have Mark Gibson, and then
Right, sure.
and then there'll be a little panel chit chat. Thank you, George.
All righty. Well, let's talk a little bit about unlicensed transmitters at 6 gigahertz. Tom introduced those. We know that back in the day, several years ago, there was an awful lot of discussion politically about increasing the use of radio spectrum. Well, that became a very hot topic. Our brethren in Silicon Valley took up on that concept and offered a modest proposal to the FCC to bring unlicensed transmitters into 6 gigahertz. In later in the year, the proposal was offered. The FCC put out a notice of proposed rulemaking to propose adding unlicensed transmitters to the licensed 6 gigahertz bands. And a couple of years later, in April, they actually released the report and order that authorized that. The things that report and order did was to authorize the use of standard power devices that Tom talked about earlier, either indoor or outdoor, and under the control of an automatic frequency coordination system. Also, low power devices were authorized indoors that required no control whatsoever. The AFC operators are just now going into operation, and we'll be seeing those AFC systems coming online pretty soon. But I just want to point out that nothing changed with regard to the primary status of licensed users. Licensed users are still the primary operators in the band, and they have the legal right to operate without interference from any of these unlicensed transmitters. Easier said than done, of course. The AFC operators were recently authorized. There are 7 of those now. There may be more later, but currently these are the folks that will be operating the indoor and outdoor high normal power units. We're also starting to see the availability of the unlicensed devices. It's going to be a pretty big market. The suppliers of these devices are suggesting that they'll be producing an aggregate of 30 or 40 million units per year, starting out with an annual budget, annual sales of an order of $1 billion, but increasing significantly over that. Of course, the 24.2 is an aggregate number. It's not an annual number. Right now, these systems are typically called Wi-Fi 6Es, which is a modification of the existing 802.11ax standard. That standard does not really apply to 6 gigahertz, but it has been augmented to provide this 6 gigahertz systems. The first truly compliant unlicensed device will be the Wi-Fi 7s, which are coming out this year. Actually, some of them came out last year, but the standard will be ratified this year. And of course, it will continue to evolve. Today, there are 12 suppliers of these unlicensed devices, but as time goes on, I'm sure we can expect more people to be supplying those. But at any rate, the unusual thing about those from a transmission capacity perspective is these units will provide up to 3 gigabits per second transmission capacity, significantly higher than what we've seen in the past in unlicensed radio lands. The report and order created 4 new unlicensed bands, Uni 5, 6, 7, and 8, and I believe Tom talked a little bit about those earlier. The standard power outdoor units will have access to the Uni 5 and Uni 7 bands, whereas the low power indoor units can be in any of the 4 bands. One of the issues with the licensed users is what will be the power coming from the uncontrolled low low power devices in buildings. The thing that will be protecting the licensed users is the building entry loss, or the amount of attenuation that the building offers to a radio signal that's coming from inside that building. But that building entry loss can be highly variable, and if there is a unlicensed device causing interference, it's going to be very challenging to find that. It's quite possible that we will have a new job description, interference bounty hunter. Don't know if we're going to have any of those, but finding interference, if it occurs, will be challenging to the licensed user. So, what should a fixed service operator do in anticipation of potential interference? Well, there are at least three things that he or she should be doing. First, since the AFC units will be protecting systems based on the FCC's ULS database, you'll want to be sure that your fixed licensed service is adequately described by the ULS database. So update the ULS database if necessary. Then you need to perform a risk analysis on your system. Is it likely that you would have interference? And if so, where could it come from? And then lastly, you want to monitor your network's performance and be prepared to take action if interference occurs. Well, first, check with your coordinator to make sure that your license system is adequately described in the FCC's ULS database. Next, doing a risk assessment of your network. This is an actual police radio network in Dallas, Texas. It will be operating at lower 6 gigahertz, and it definitely will have potential interference from a hotel that is not too many feet away from their receive antenna at Dallas City Hall. That obviously is an opportunity for interference, and they better be paying attention to that. Also, folks can perform an analysis of your network if desirable. I represent a company that will be happy to take all the buildings that are in front of your receive antenna and do an analysis of those, although that's very labor intensive, very computationally intensive. Typically, there are 50,000 buildings in front of an antenna, but we can do that if that's of interest to you. You need to establish a baseline for your microwave link. These are some of the parameters you might take a look at, but the radio vendors are creating software that will do some of this activity for you. But there are several things that you could do to prepare yourself for potential interference. If you have interference, you can ask for help from the FCC. This is a list of the items that the FCC would like you to provide for them if you believe that you're having interference. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole list. Excuse me, I assume that if you're interested in this, that you'll download the paper and take a look at it in detail. But basically, this is the checklist that the FCC would like you to go through if you think you're having interference from an external source. These are the folks at the FCC that you'll want to talk to. You'll first talk to the field offices. If that doesn't get you the response you need, you'll want to buck this up to headquarters and talk to the folks in Washington about this. But these are the people responsible for helping work the issues that you may have. So, from a high-level perspective, frequency management is changing. Now, frequency management is a shared responsibility between the regulatory agencies and the users. Fixed services need to verify their license records. They need to perform a link analysis, and they need to monitor their link's performance, and then be prepared to take action if necessary. Times are changing. As Tom mentioned, we are evolving. Things are not the way they used to be 20 years ago. We are now evolving into a different type of frequency management. we're going to have to evolve and change and adapt to this new world of shared frequencies. Any questions?
The slides be available. There's a lot of good information on the slides.
Yes, the slides will be put, they're asking George if the slides will be available. Yes.
Yes, they will.
NSMA.org.
Yeah, you didn't need to take it. You didn't need to take any detailed notes. The slides would be available, so you can peruse those later at your leisure. And still have questions, give me an email.
Any other questions for George? Seeing none, we're going to move to Mark Gibson and George, stick around because we'll have the panel discussion after Mark.
I will do that.
Well, thanks again for the opportunity to talk to everybody today. I'm reminded, that, you talked about this being the 40th anniversary of NSMA. Remember in 1984, having a conversation with Bill Lai about my passion at that time was the digital electronic message service. And that is in the 10.0 to 10.5 gig band. And Kara talked about that this morning. That band has a request for rulemaking, so everything old is new again. I'd also like to start with a plug for the Wind Forum. Joe mentioned the Wind Forum, and so did Tom, about the work the Wind Forum did about the standards here. If you're interested at all in the National Spectrum Strategy, in June 25th, 26th, and 27th, I forget the exact dates of when the session is, Wind Forum is going to have several panels on the National Spectrum Strategy with folks from the government, including guys from NTIA that are in the trenches. So if you're interested, just Google Wind Forum because I can't remember the URL, or just see me. Lastly, the title of this session is 6 gigahertz in the headlights. So to the extent that headlights light up things in front of you, both near and far, this is a little bit out there, but it's going to happen. And so I thought what I've got here is sort of a synopsis of the rulemaking that's setting up very low power geofenced operation. We've been deeply involved in that. This is not in the here and now. I'd say this is probably 2 years out, best case, but it's something that for microwave operators, which this group really encompasses, we need to be aware of. You've seen this before. This is essentially the 6 gigahertz band. What I want to point out to those that aren't, can see here, the bottom part of it is where the very low power is going to operate. I'm going to focus on this conversation on geofenced very low power operation. What the commission did in the rulemaking was they pulled this apart. They asked about very low power, which I think was power below 14 dBm, with a power spectral density, I think, of -1 dBm per megahertz, but don't quote me on that. And then they talked about the ability to have that power raised a little bit up to 21 dBm and 14 dBm per megahertz to support mobility, among other things. So that kind of brings in a whole new dimension to this notion of automated frequency management. So you'll see here the bands, the portions of the bands this is looking at is the whole thing. Very low power with geofence operation can possibly occur across the whole 1200 megahertz. So it's going to be a big deal if and when it ever gets off the ground. Some of the use cases for this are kind of interesting. I don't think there's any use cases you'd see here that you haven't seen in other dimensions. Body area networks were the thing that I thought were interesting, is having VR, AR, VR, a lot of vehicular type activity that's not CV2X. So a lot of interesting things. I pulled this out of the rulemaking that was filed by a lot of the proponents here. But first, how many people have tried to use screen mirroring with your iPhone or your iPad? It's terrible. So hopefully this will work better. And so a bunch of other things, like I said, in vehicle, a lot, I know I met Manisha in the days with wireless medical telemetry. She was with Philips, and, ComSearch manages with ASHI, the medical telemetry database. So a much more robust monitoring framework using unlicensed. So there's a lot of promise in the band. So we have to see how that gets realized. So, this is going to be a really pithy discussion, so I'm not going to dwell on all of the details. This is going to be made available. You can use this as a reference if you want to. I encourage you to read the rulemaking if you're so interested. What I did was I put the paragraph areas where this is. The paragraphs actually in rulemakings are numbered. So the paragraphs where these are highlighted are numbered here. So the first thing it says is VLP devices operating above -5 DPM have to be operated under a geofencing system, and then the geofence devices can operate up to 14 dBm max EIRP with -1 dBm per megahertz power spectral density. So that's higher, and the fact that these things can move, can cause some consternation among incumbents. They have to use power control, and they also have to comply with emission masks, pretty much the same emission masks that exist out there right now. And then the commission asked some other questions about that type of operation. But the other thing the commission says is that any very low power operation that occurs above, cannot read that without my glasses, I think 5925 megahertz, they have to prioritize spectrum below that because of the existence of the CB2X operations. And then, there's a geofenced operation. So I've used this slide before. What does geofencing look like? For AFCs, a lot of us are doing either calculating exclusion zones or calculating interference on the fly. If you take a look at this is a filing we did at the earlier part of the early rulemaking. If you look at this in terms of the spectrum availability, it really carves out what would look like the antenna pattern. And so that's what you see here. So for all intents and purposes, when the commission refers in the rulemaking to exclusion zones, they're talking about these things here. And so, in the green ones are areas where you've got, one exclusion zone, an exclusion zone that is occasioned by a single microwave link. And when they overlap in the same band, you'll see that, they get different colors. So the red means that there's no spectrum available, yellow means there's a little, and green means there's some. And so that's what we're looking at, is be able to calculate these exclusion zones and determine when a device is operating either inside or outside an exclusion zone. And if anybody remembers the early days of PCS in the 1.9 gig band, we did the exact same calculations. And I know George was with TIA. I know Will there chairs the committee with TR 14.11 or now TBS 10. We did the exact same thing, is figure out where these exclusion zones were. So some other, aspects of this, the devices must have an integrated antenna so that you can't attach an external antenna to get better signal strength using antenna with higher gain. Have to use a geofence. And the commission has left it open how this will work. I've got 3 slides on some of thoughts around how geofencing might work, given the commission's, riffing on that, I guess you could say. I guess the one thing that I found interesting, if not slightly scary, is that they're allowing geofence devices to be mobile, to operate in mobility. That could include on cars, trains, boats, and aircraft operating above 10,000 feet. So, your typical Acela runs up and down the coast at approaching 190 miles an hour. An aircraft above 10,000 feet. I'm a pilot. I can fly above 10,000 feet. I'm flying about 120, 130 knots. That's pretty fast. All things considered. So how is a geofencing system going to take into consideration that? I have no idea. What I've shown here on the slide is just an example of using Dallas again, where you might have a device going down I-35 headed from Dallas, to Waco or Waxahachie. And that device can be, in a vehicle operating, the speed limit on I-35 is 70 miles an hour, actually 75 miles an hour. So that's running along at a pretty clip. I think 75 miles an hour is 140 feet per second. So that's not like anything we're dealing with right now in the AFC framework. This sort of gets a little bit more into the nuances of the devices. One of the things Kara talked about earlier this morning, was the concept of client-to-client communications. And what the commission sets up in these sets of paragraphs is whether or not that should be allowed for geofenced operation and very low power operation. I'm not sure many people dug through the comments and the replies in this rulemaking. Yours truly did, because it's what I do. They were all over the place with respect to other things. Generally, the incumbent community was not crazy about client-to-client communications, and actually some potential users of the spectrum were not crazy about that either, largely because of issues with coexistence with each other. So we'll have to see how that sorts out as the commission goes through the rulemaking. I talked to Ira Keltz the other day. Ira is the deputy chief of the OET at the commission. And I said, well, what are your guys' next steps here? And he said, we're still going through. It was 27 comments and 20 replies, I think, something like that. So, and they were all over the place, and most of them were over, 8 pages. Double space, and it's not a ton of reading, but still, they had to deal with that. So here's one example of the commission's sort of, like I said, riffing on potential architectures. And it's really two architectures. One is sort of a subtext of the other architecture. In this architecture, the commission suggested that the data are provided directly to the device, and the device has on board the capability of doing the calculations for exclusion zones. That sets up this whole situation of how is the FCC data provisioned. You'll see the two databases up here that I mentioned are the ULS, which as we all know is the Universal Licensing System, and most of us also are familiar with the COLS, which is the Cable Operation and Licensing System. I'm sure we know that when we do frequency coordination work, the ULS is not an engineering database. If you have any experience with the COLS database, it is so not an engineering database. I think calling it a database is an insult to databases. And this is nothing against the commission. It's just it's a database. I see Bob, it's a lot of cable stuff in there, a lot of broadcast stuff in there. Just, it's a sorry excuse for a database. And we're supposed to use that for this. So I'm not responsible for anything I say, or my company is not responsible for anything I say here. And again, the commission sort of, they give a nod to their lack of the COLS database to being supported. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. So what I did is I inserted this cloud that's some sort of a data provisioning entity that will take the commission's data and package it in some form that's useful. You don't need all the data out of the COLS. There's not much data in the COLS really that you can use, so you got to figure out how to get that. And then there's ULS data. So again, the key thing is here, in order to support mobility, you can't have a device pinging getting data on a real-time basis, like what we're doing with AFC, like what we're doing with CBRS, like what we did with TV Whitespace, and even like what we did in the past with this thing called the Frequency Agile Sharing Technology, which was a sharing method that was used for PCS. So this is going to have to be, all of the smarts are resident on board the device. And that brings up several comments. If you read the rulemaking, a lot of the people that commented questioned how that would work in the context of device certification. Another architecture is, instead of provisioning the data to the device, what you have is this cloud thing in the middle that does the calculations, and it provisions the exclusion zones to the device. So that might make it a little bit easier for certification, but at the end of the day, you've got something that's got to provision things to devices in near real time, especially if devices are moving. In my opinion, this is probably the one that makes the most sense, because you can calculate the exclusion zones separately and just send them to the device as needed. But you don't have to send everything. Device knows where it is. Part of the message that would go back to this thing from the device is, here's what I am, here's where I am, and maybe some information as terms of a velocity vector. And then, the database should have smarts to know that, okay, I need to send everything into this device in like the Washington, D.C. area, unless it's on an airplane where it may be, the East Coast. And then lastly, here's sort of another riff on that where I think you're sending the same thing, calculations. So, take a look at this if you're interested. These were the three things the commission defined or identified in the rulemaking. Then they get into how a microwave are going to be protected. Tom talked about the protection criteria of 6 dB below noise. I think I would just say as a commentary, and this is just me speaking maybe, that, it'd be nice to get away from this 6 dB below noise interference protection criteria. We have a lot more capability, in the world of spectrum management to use more robust methods. And if we're going to be putting, interference to devices, we can be better than 6 dB below noise, better in terms of protection and in spectrum availability. Body loss of 4 dB came sort of out of the blue. There's a reference to and I had to dig to find this reference. It was in one of the filings from the proponents. The commission put it in here. If you read the comments on the rulemaking, some people it sort of smelled, a fish and said, that's great, but if you're in a car, with the device that's sort of operating near the windows of the vehicle, you're not going to get no body loss. So why do that? And they added that body loss across the board. And then there's a protection to the BAS in cars. I'll talk about that. Kind of the same thing. Using the same propagation models as for AFC, which I think is another thing. Manish is going to talk about some spectrum measurement work that we've done, or she's done. And I know Andy Clegg has done work. We've done work. There's a wealth of data that's out there that can improve our spectrum modeling. Actually, we could have more real-time spectrum propagation modeling. And then there's radio astronomy gets protected in a certain portion of the spectrum, and it's co-channel protection exclusively, and no aggregation. So for the broadcast auxiliary, as I mentioned, the database is not the best. What the commission suggested, given that for a lot of broadcast operations, in terms of E&G, electronic news gathering, for example, when the bridge fell in Baltimore about a month and a half ago, and I just used that because I saw them blow the bits off it, which was really cool. There was an E&G vans that were sent there, and I'm not sure if you saw any of the comments by our governor or Maryland governor from there, but there were these news trucks all over the place, and I thought, yeah, perfect example of electronic news gathering where you can't frequency coordinate this stuff in a time frame that's sufficient for geofencing operation. So the commission suggested that the geofenced operators, whomever they may be, develop some sort of a portal that will allow the broadcasters to enter their information as soon as they go off on the roll, which, I give Bob a minute. How well is that going to work, So if you read the rulemaking, a lot of folks had issues with that. We'll see. Our comments said, please don't do that, because that's, if you go back to TV white space, this whole notion of putting a portal up there to allow for a wireless microphone operation is marginally successful. Actually, it's more successful than I thought it would be, but I had low expectations. The other thing that's up here is the counts that I pulled out of the ULS. I couldn't use the Coles because, as I said, it's not a database. But, there's a lot of operation up there. And so, it's important to just keep in track of that. So one of the suggestions that was spectrum made available for safe channels. I think the broadcast community or the E&G community asked for some like 50 some megahertz. I won't comment on that, but that seems to make sense. This is just a slide to show the complexity of geofence operation with devices that are moving. So this map is really this chart is a chart of miles per hour versus feet per minute. And so a device operating at 200 miles an hour is operating nearly 116,000 feet per minute. So the recheck interval we have right now for AFC is once every day. So, that's going to have to change. The commission talks in the rulemaking about, that can't happen. And the recheck interval needs to be a function of how fast the device is moving. So now already you've got to have some information on the device so it knows how fast it's moving and possibly the direction that it's going so it knows what the recheck interval is in certain directions. So again, stay tuned. And this is all of the stuff they use in terms of their calculation. It's assumed the height of 1.5 meters, which is cool, except for the devices that are on board aircraft above 10,000 feet. And other things, again, with respect to, comments and stuff like that. So again, you can read this on your own, and that's it. So that was a whirlwind trip through the rulemaking, but if there's any questions, happy to take them. Yeah.
So, okay. Awesome information, right? Thank you so much. So two things I want to comment and question on. The first thing is, looks like the whole thing about very low power, specifically outside and geofencing enabled, is kind of not even cooked yet.
No, it's not. No.
Right? So I think a lot of work needs to be done there. The second is saying that, but the thing about mobility for Wi-Fi, it's really not, I think it's not fully understood because Wi-Fi, if I take the router and my low power device and I move around, or right now my smartphone is Wi-Fi, I move around, I have mobility, and I'll be still, because I'm the same router is covering, right? There's nothing like mobility in Wi-Fi, like in mobile cellular network, as soon as I walk out of this access point, right? Out of the router. So to me, when people say mobility and they get scared, that's because these are devices for you, like this thing with the platform with this ultra low power. I mean, these things are mobile, but they're still not mobile like in cellular where they can go anywhere, right?
Well, they could be. What I brought back was the picture I had for some of the use cases. And so the one that you probably can't see very well is the one there on the left. And essentially what it is, it's the wireless vehicle. We dig into CB2X and a lot of the adjacent technologies, and even now, I'm renting a car because my headlights did not illuminate the deer that was in front of me a couple of weeks ago. So, but, and so it has Wi-Fi in it. you know, which is, I didn't, you know, that's very cool. So I didn't know that was, you know, there. So anyhow, so they're talking about all this stuff that's on board the vehicle, not necessarily these are extensions outside the vehicle. And so that's the thing. And think about CV2X being able to use your car as a, you know, a hotspot. So that's what they're thinking about.
Talk to each other and
Yeah.
like that. That I understand, but I think it's still very different from the mobility aspects, which has a lot of mobility control. In
Yeah.
the network.
Well, I think that the rulemaking is going to, this is again, my personal opinion is that the commission's probably going to have to pull out this whole geofencing discussion and have its own arc. It may be under the context of this rulemaking, but they've got to do a lot more there. The comments on this and the replies were not generally aligned with how this would work.
And with some data probably would help.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yep.
Somebody
Actually, it's a
has-
great lead into Monisha. So yeah. So anyhow, thanks. I'm happy to talk after. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. And we have Dr. Manisha Ghosh. And I guess we'll get the.
You know, for geolocation to work, they have to figure out GPS location in downtown Chicago. I mean, it puts me 10 blocks over most of the time when I'm in downtown Chicago.
Well, you know, dead reckoning, you know, which is funny, the term dead reckoning, the dead part, but anyhow, you know, that's a lot of what could be used. And actually vehicles that do their own dead reckoning, you know, with sensors, but still.
So I realize lunch is waiting for most of you, so I will try to keep it short. Thank you very much to the previous speakers for setting up the stage so beautifully. There was a lot of talk about real world measurements and how much we need those. And I believe that we actually, our group and my students and I, we have probably the most amount of 6 gigahertz LPI data that's out there. So what I'll talk about is the way we've been going about this you know, we've taken measurements at the University of Michigan and at the University of Notre Dame. This is not a PC, okay. Am I pressing the wrong button here? This one?
That one,
No,
that one.
no, none of those are okay.
It worked for me.
Maybe just if I click. Next. Okay, I did. Oh, probably this is better. Thank you. So what we started this work last January actually, and we really were motivated by looking at unbiased statistics. So much of the discourse around interference to incumbents was worst case, was about you know, access points being put into windows in the main beam of a fixed length and interference happening, not necessarily harmful interference, but interference. So we really wanted to understand what does a dense deployment of LPI APs, when we started this work, there was no standard power, look like in the real world, and what is the footprint of outdoor signal strength coming from such a deployment. If we wanted to look at probability of interference, in this whole spectrum sharing world, we come up with hard numbers, -6 dB I over N, and we don't talk enough about the statistical nature of interference. Along the way, we realized as the client-to-client discussions heated up that the measurements we were making can inform that debate. So for those who don't know what client-to-client is, it's the current rules that came out in 2020 do not allow two client devices to talk directly to each other, even if they're indoors. So they have to always go through an indoor access point. And in many cases, there are applications where devices may want to exchange. So this is kind of what you have inside Link in LTE and cellular, and you have peer-to-peer in Wi-Fi in 5 gigahertz. But in 6 gigahertz, it was not permitted the first time around, because while you can guarantee that the LPI AP is indoors, there was no guarantee that the client devices were indoors. So they could be outdoors, and they did not allow client-to-client because there weren't any mechanisms that had been agreed on as to how do you ensure that these clients are not outdoors. The other contribution of the measurements we did was measuring building entry loss. We've talked about that a few times. And there's again one number that is used in the link budgets that were used in the ruling. And we did a very ballpark estimate in the measurements that we did and in the scenarios that we did to look at what the interference signal levels would be at fixed link receivers. We did not have access to the receivers. We knew where they were from the ULS database, which I think was more or less accurate for this purpose. But we did not really have access to those receivers. And we really, all of these measurements have actually been submitted to the FCC in ex partes and comments. Okay. So how do we do these measurements? And this is actually very simple. My students are here and they developed this. The one that we used for the most of the measurements here is a SIGCAP. So this is an Android-based app, which is basically collecting the information from the beacon element that every Wi-Fi access point is running. So if you're sitting in this room and you're running SIGCAP, you'll basically, every single BSSID that it can receive at this point, it'll pick up. Along with that, it'll get, of course, the location, the timestamp, what channel it's operating on, what the signal strength is, what the BSSID or the MAC address of the access point is. Newer access point have optional elements that are actually very useful in this analysis. It'll tell you how many stations are connected to that particular access point. It'll tell you channel utilization, which is a measure of how often that access point is backing off. So it gives you an indication of how used that access point is. And it'll tell you the transmit power of that access point. We've used a bunch of devices, Pixel 6s and S21 and S22. We've done some in-depth studies using Wireshocks in particular locations where we do a deep dive into the packet and look much more into things like retransmission and what other more granular information. And those we run on laptops. And back then we had to replace the Wi-Fi card on the Intel. Now there are newer laptops which are coming out with Wi-Fi 6E in them. All of these RSSI measurements that we are reporting are just on the 20 megahertz beacon channel. So it is a good measure to understand how the so-called enabling signal in client to client might work. We took these measurements driving, walking, and in one case, we actually strapped the phone on a drone and sent it up and down a building to take measurements as well. So this is, a map of the deployment area we covered. University of Michigan is probably the world's largest LPI AP deployment at this point, 16,000 and climbing access points, all of which are Wi-Fi 6E, deployed across 225 buildings across both campuses, Ann Arbor and Dearborn. We did in-depth measurements in 2 areas of the campus. We labeled them the main campus area. There's a lot of pedestrian access here, and the residential area. 6 gigahertz fixed links. Most of the receivers were very far away, like many, many kilometers away. There was one receiver over here, but it was pointed away from all of the deployment. So this is an example of when we look at interference, is we need to look at how all these probabilities add up, right? You have the probability of actually this signal causing an interference. You have the probability of a receiver being exactly at the place where that interference might be a problem, and its face and its beam is faced in the right directions. So this exercise was really to get a sense of what these probabilities look like. Again, some more details about the deployment. We were indoors, outdoors. We took detailed measurements outside buildings. Our first measurement campaign was in January. We went back in summer, and there were some changes here that we saw. This is the drone. We strapped the phone on the drone. We just turned SIGCAP on, and this phone kept collecting data as this drone flew around the buildings. And the reason to do this was to get a sense of what does the signal strength from these access points looks up there, because that's where the interference is happening. The interference is not happening on the ground most of the time. Lots of heat maps. So what the thing you'll notice over here is that these green pins are all the buildings which have Wi-Fi access points in them. We drove the entire area, and really the signal strength is located outside the buildings. Now you can interpret this in two ways, that wow, there's 6 gigahertz everywhere outside. Yes, in a lot of places, the signal strengths are really low. In the residential area also we walked around and we collected again and measurements all over the city. The key takeaway from here is that you have a high concentration of APs. You do have higher outdoor RSSI close to the buildings. However, we don't think that that's really a problem in terms of interference, and we'll talk about that later. We've done a lot of statistical analysis of median access points. So again, here is the thing of, if you just look at, what is the highest RSSI you get and focus on that, it can be high, but it's much better to look at the median or maybe the 90%, 10% numbers. And those numbers are in the minus 80 dBm range. So median values of outside RSSI is pretty low. The APs also, because this is a dense enterprise deployment, are not even transmitting at the full power they're allocated to under LPI rules. They're usually 15 to 21 dBm over 80 megahertz, I believe. So that is about 3 dB lower than they could be transmitted. This is the drone measurement. Again, we quantified it by height. Two takeaways from here. One is that as you go up in height, the signal strength decreases because most of the access points are serving people inside the building. There's not a lot of leakage that's happening up through the roof. There is one point here, if you're noticing, which is minus 45 dBm, which is really, really high for outdoor signal strength. When we looked at where this data point was gathered, it was when the drone was right outside the glass window, which had, a corner glass window, and the access point was right in there. So clearly, yes, you're going to have outliers. But if you focus on this outlier as your measure of interference, that's not the right way to approach this. So again, this is a very back of the envelope calculation. We said, okay, how do we estimate what the I over N ratio is? We heard about minus 6 dB. What we found is, given the links in the region and the measurements that we were getting on the ground, we took the highest measurement we could, not the median. And we used that in the analysis to see, even if that signal level was in the main lobe of this fixed link, which is very unlikely, the fact that this receiver was so far away from this deployment, we came up with I over N numbers, which were way, way low. And so again, are there going to be different deployments in parts of the country where you're going to have, the beam pointed right at you at a window? Yes. What is the probability of that happening? We think it is quite low. Building entry loss, the interesting thing we found is that, yes, if you're near a window, it can be much less than the 20 dB. But on the other hand, when you're close to a solid brick wall, you're receiving nothing. So we counted the number of BSSIDs we could see inside, and we counted the number of BSSIDs we could see when we were outside. And I don't think we have that number here, but I do have it in Notre Dame. The number of BSSIDs that you can actually receive outside is a fraction, it's like 5% of what is deployed. So a lot of the simulation results I've seen assume that if you have a building with 100 access points, each one of those access points is going to have the same building loss. It is absolutely not true. Most of these access points are very deep inside buildings. You will never even see them outside. So trying to get the statistics again of how many of these access points really pose a interference threat is important. So University of Notre Dame, University of Michigan is not that far, but we can't keep going, schlepping up and down. So thankfully, we have deployments happening in universities. In general, for folks who are trying to get measurements, universities are great places because a lot of these universities are upgrading Wi-Fi, and they usually do it, they're not replacing one Wi-Fi, they're usually doing the entire university, or they're doing entire buildings. So we have at least one building that has been fully upgraded, that has got 70 Wi-Fi access points, each with 2 BSSIDs, so you're really looking at 140. The transmit power actually on this has been said to be fairly low. It's 15 dBm over 80 megahertz. There are some fixed links in the area, which we have not got around to analyzing the effects of this on those fixed links. So here is, again, we've done similar analysis. What is interesting here is this building has glass windows in the front and it has a brick wall in the back. If you look at where the signal is, it's, yeah, you're getting a little bit of high signal strength right outside the glass windows. You go to the back of the building, there's almost nothing. CDF of the number of the RSSI here, it's actually a bit lower than what we saw in Michigan. It's partly because this is one building and partly because we think the construction of this building is different. This one shows you the number of BSSIDs. And here is where you'll see the median number of BSSIDs that you're seeing outside is like 3 or 4. And we have 140, no, 3 or 4%, and we have about 140 BSSIDs deployed in this building. So the very, very small percentage of those BSSIDs actually will give you, any measurable signal strength. Finally, I'll talk about a little bit about C2C operations. So there's a lot of discussion about what should the appropriate enabling signal level be. The concept here is access point sends out a certain signal. If you're a client, if you can measure that signal at a certain level, then you can be more or less assured that you're indoors, and so you can commence client-to-client communication. So we tried to ask ourselves, what is, how can we use our measurements to inform this level? So what we did was we have a lot of measurements inside the building, and we walked all over the building and collected RSSI at every time stamp. And at every time stamp, we looked at the maximum RSSI because that would be the enabling signal we would pick. We did the same thing outside. First of all, there's a big gap, but the way to pick the level is as follows. If we pick minus 80 dBm as the enabling signal level, what we see is that 98.6% of your indoor devices will be connected, but so will 12% of your outdoor devices. So as you move this line this way, so you're increasing the threshold, you will get fewer outdoor access points enabled and maybe a fewer indoor ones enabled as well. So if you pick 78 as your enabling signal level, you will still get, a fair number of your indoor locations could avail of C2C, but you've dropped your outdoor locations to only 7%. And most of those 7% are probably clustered right in front of that building anyway, and they would have anyway maybe be connected to an indoor access point. So even if they did C2C, the interference risk did not go up. So I guess just to conclude and leave maybe 5 minutes for a panel discussion is, we're doing these measurements. We are looking very closely at how we can extend this to AFC-enabled outdoor. We think that some of this work can also inform the discussions on hybrid sharing that's happening across the pond, because I think there's the only data set which actually gives you numbers on what these signal levels look like outside and how those may or may not interfere with incumbents. Thank you.
So, have you seen the effects of signals and
Wi-Fi, because it is by nature, it is doing back off. So, and this is a very dense deployment. So the access points are backing off to each other, right? There are not too many devices connected yet to these access points because there are not that many 6 gigahertz devices yet. We may see more of that as it happens. But again, given the nature, 6 gigahertz does not propagate very far, right? So the likelihood, and the other thing we didn't show here, but it's there in the paper, is that we have many more channels. So the energy is getting distributed over many more channels instead of, 28 access points congregating on one channel in one location. So we don't have any data that shows that that is happening yet. But this is a continuing effort, and we'll definitely see if we do see that beginning to happen.
Great. Thank you for that. That's really intriguing and it adds a nice element to this ongoing continuing revelation that we have at 6 gigahertz. And I don't know if we have any questions. I have one I wanted to start with, which was something that's been a perennial. If you took your measurement system to downtown Chicago or somewhere where there's 150 incumbents and a lot of areas where there's no room for new incumbents, and of course you'd probably, I know, right, you said now Anne Arbor and Dearborn are the world's largest, maybe AP collection, but presumably downtown Chicago by 2028 or something is going to have triple or quadruple or 90-fold of that or whatever. So this August panel, as well as George and the ether, what is that going to look like in terms of iterating and really measuring those kinds of situations?
And that's actually one of the things that we plan to continue doing, because our measurement system is basically a phone with an app. We can walk around and take these measurements very easily. So within Spectrum X, we are not focused on Wi-Fi yet. We're much more focused on cellular, but we have this project called Broadband Mappers, where students, undergraduate students, across the footprint of universities that are part of Spectrum X are collecting data.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of 6 gigahertz out there yet, but it has to be a longitudinal effort, and we will definitely report on what we see as this. Our students are here and they're actually taking data on 6 gigahertz and they're walking around. You can see there's 6 gigahertz around.
Yeah, the more data, the better. And this is awesome that that's underway. And as we go to versions 2 and 3 and 4.
Use our methodology.
Yeah. And the spectrum analyzers, the form factor, some spectrum analyzers with antenna, some antenna probes have to be 2 feet long. You can't put them in a phone. So there'll be some of those issues, I think, as well, will be overlaid with the data that comes in. I think it'll be amazing to see that. I don't know, but what do you all?
Tom knows this, that when we dealt with building entry loss in the context of inference determination for AFC, it was a religious discussion. In fact, it was almost like crusades. Everybody got killed and nobody won. Well, we shouldn't say that. We ended up with a number that was the worst best with the best worst. Tom did a ton of work on that. And I think the problem is that because it's a religious discussion, it wasn't informed by data.
Yeah.
So I think we're really eager to see more of the data. I think you've just done 2 locations, maybe reaching out to people to gather more. But the other side of that is using it to develop better, not just in building, but better propagation. The model we're using is the Franken model. That again, it was the best worst of the worst best ever. And the same thing we did with CBRS, and it doesn't lend itself. I mean, it's instantiated in rules, so to change it, we've got to go back and change the rules. So I really think more of the work you're doing would be really helpful.
Yeah, I just add that obviously the more data we've got, the better situation we're in to do things in an intelligent manner. I mean, the models themselves are written in the rules. It's part of part 15.407 says what the models are. But there's still some leeway in there because there's various parameters in the propagation model that do have to be set. And a lot of the work that happened within the Wind Forum was discussions about what are the best ways to set those parameters. What value should we hit? So, if we do get new data, which gives us a better view as to what's going on, we may want to go back and revisit those parameters, and maybe we adjust them a little bit to try to get the models to fit the measurements in a better manner. But Mark's right. A lot of it was really guesswork. I mean, and you have to understand within the Wind Forum, you've got a lot of different people there. They're coming from different companies that have different economic incentives. And they've all got different, they're all, capable engineers, but they've all come with different backgrounds, with different experience. So there were a lot of different views that had to be negotiated and discussed within the Wind Forum to come up to, some number. So data is always a better place to be than just sort of a feeling, right? I mean, that's always a better place.
Absolutely. Just another area study when you would take on is being able to find a method to determine what is the building, determine and quantify the building, because right now there's no way for devices to know that.
So that is another thing that we are working on is basically, and we have a paper from 2 years ago, which we are updating on using the signal strengths of not just Wi-Fi, but so if I look at the RF picture in this room, it's very different. It's like a big RF image from what you would get if you went outside. So we collected a lot of data and we're using that in learning models and classification models to robustly, our results right now show that, we can get 99% accuracy in this classification. So I think that is definitely doable of actually letting the device figure out if it's indoors. And if you can do that reliably, then you open up a whole new way of looking at spectrum.
Well, and also not only the devices indoor outdoor, but to be able to identify what amount of buildings you want to use.
Is near a window. So
Yeah.
what we are doing these three-way classifiers now. Are you deep inside a building like here, or are you near a window, or are you outside? So we are trying to do that.
Well, George, if you're here, feel free to jump in, and otherwise we're going to take some questions. Are you listening, George? Maybe he's either on mute or we might have lost
Yes,
him.
I am, but I couldn't hear the question.
Oh, okay. No, we're just wondering, I don't know if you heard all the presentations or any of the discussion. If you wanted to throw in any commentary, if you were chewing at the bit for any commentary, this is your big moment.
No, I can't think of anything that I would add to what's already said. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions, and I know we got lunch on the hoof. Yes, sir.
Hi, I work alongside most of these folks in 6 gigahertz. Glad to see you first. One thing that's missing here that I have some direct experience with the broadcasters at 6 gigahertz. They have bounce paths. They don't always go straight to the site. There's more than a 36 dB gain loss between comms, microphones, and smart people. That 36 dB gets expressed, if I could say that, through bounce pads. A lot of the work we've been focused on hasn't addressed. It leads to thinking microwave dish is so strong practice. Any comments from you folks?
Well, I'd say go back and look at the record on both of them. The AFC operation wasn't a big deal for broadcast because it wasn't. Look at the very low power and the gauge. There's a lot of really good content. Many big puts stuff on. I don't know if SBE put anything, but I know the EVAS guys did. So yeah, but there was a lot of good commentary on how that broadcast auxiliary is used. And I think it not only countered what the commission said, I think it enhanced what the commission said. And that's why I think that, they're not ready to do an order on this anytime soon. And so I think, just wait. I think that the broadcast community needs to wait in.
NSMA has been very consistent, kind of a one-note band on the subject of measurement. The more measurements we can do, the more criteria, the more funding for measurement, the more real world, especially real world, not desktop, the better off we're all going to be and more realistic we're going to be, right? So if, highly encourage if you, what is your name? Hey, Rich Lay. Okay, Rich Lay, famous from Georgia's Slide. Well, yeah, feel free to submit some. You and Andy, Andy. All right, great. Yeah, if you want to, submit some for suggestions, some measurement criteria. NSMA is constantly thinking about how to propose to the commission more measurement criteria. We've been talking about this at 6 gig for years, so we're super happy to do that. Any other questions? Enjoy your lunch, and thank you, panelists.